Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of Trialogues. I'm Lindsay Planetta, and I wanted to welcome this morning, once again, Rob Hahn, who is the managing partner of 7DS Associates. Most of you guys know him as Notorious Rob from his blog. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm very good. And we have Gaylord DeWald. Gaylord is president and janitor of Thought Faucet, a strategic content studio based in Burlington, Vermont. How's Vermont this morning?
It's pretty good. We've actually got some sunshine, which is like the first time in a month or something like that. So the weather is great today.
Good. I'm glad we have included our usual weather update. It's hot as hell here in Houston. And, of course, we have Matthew Shadbolt. Matthew is the Director of Interactive Product and Marketing at the Corcoran Group in New York City. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, everyone. How you doing?
Very good. All right, you guys. Well, I thought we'd go ahead and maybe continue the conversation from last time, talk a little bit about Zillow and brand white space. And do you want to restart that, Rob? Pick up where we were.
Sure. I don't quite remember exactly what I was going to get chewed out of, but maybe we'll rediscover. I think, as we ended the last week's, cliffhanger episode, the thing that I was really wondering about, was we talked a lot about Zillow and their new branding campaigns and their new ad, with the soldiers, the deployed, sort of touching, that sort of thing. But the thing that I kind of got to wondering is why there was a brand white space in real estate to begin with. And I can't really remember, what it was I said that was a false equivalency. And, certainly we haven't reviewed, last week's episode. But bring away, then Gaylord and Matthew go, that's right. That's where he said something idiotic. So the challenge, the question for me is really twofold. One is, why is a brand white space to begin with? Considering that, real estate brokerages especially have not exactly been slow on advertising themselves. I think the best example would be RE/MAX. RE/MAX has been running TV ads, for 30 years, 40 years, right? Everyone knows the balloon. We've seen all those ads, and they've really done a lot of advertising. They've really tried to do a lot of branding. So it raises the question of, was all of that advertising simply ineffective? Did they just not do enough of it? Did they not spend enough money? What's the deal, right? How is it possible that in 2013, Zillow saw an opening for creating a brand, sort of entering the branding wars because there was a brand white space? It almost seems like there should not have been a brand white space to begin with, right? That if you were to go and ask consumers, when you think of real estate, name a brand that pops to mind, you would think that they would come up with, one of maybe half a dozen brands, right, that we're all very familiar with, who have done a lot of advertising. RE/MAX, like I said, they've been doing it the longest. Century 21's run Super Bowl commercials. Coldwell Banker certainly has run TV commercials and done a lot of advertising elsewhere. Not to mention just the footprint of local brokerages that have those brands. So it's just a question, and I didn't quite understand why that brand white space was there to begin with.
I have a question for you, Rob.
Yes.
Because I was thinking about this since our conversation last week. What do you think Zillow is eroding in terms of brand equity of the existing long-term advertising brokerages? Because that seems to be what you're suggesting, and I'm not quite sure that I agree or understand. But explain to me what you think is being eroded.
Well, see, the thing is, it's I don't know that they're eroding anything yet. I think the question I had was why the opportunity existed in the first place. Now, it meant that maybe the opportunity existed at a macro sort of national level, and that brands like RE/MAX and Coldwell Banker and Prudential, and others that have really put an emphasis on branding their company, would there be erosion? I think the erosion would be, it really is kind of, that top of mind, right? When a consumer just thinks real estate, if they start thinking Zillow, then, I think there is an erosion in a sense. In the following way, and I think maybe this was a false equivalency, I don't know. But last week I started introducing the notion of, something I wrote on the blog, I don't know, years ago, called the Home Depot effect.
right? And quite simply, Home Depot effect is like this for me. And, I've done I've done work around my house, right? I've had people come in and replace windows or, I don't know, I can't remember, get new countertops or something. And in every case, I just went to Home Depot, right? Because I figure, I need new windows, I'll go to Home Depot. And when I'm there, they make me fill out a form, and they say, we'll have installers by, et cetera. And I remember installers would roll in, some local contractor. They had a name at the side of their van, and I don't remember. I couldn't tell you what it was for the life of me. And quite frankly, as a consumer, I didn't care. Because from my standpoint, if I need work done on my house, I go to Home Depot, right? Or, conversely, it's Lowe's, right? It's those two brands that just completely dominate the psychology, if you will, of the consumer's mind when it comes to home improvement. So I could easily see something like that happening, in real estate, right? If Zillow is successful, and when a consumer thinks, hey, I want to buy, sell, rent a house, and the first name that pops in their head is Zillow, then yeah, you could see a Home Depot effect type of thing happening. Would it? It's not going to disenfranchise the agent.
Rob,
yeah, go ahead.
Rob, do you really think that? Like, do you think that the amount of time that you spend interacting with your kitchen countertop contractor is similar to the whole transaction process that a real estate agent and their clients go through?
No, I think once you are in a relationship,
do you think you wouldn't remember their name?
No, I know for a fact that I wouldn't remember the name in a lot of cases. I don't remember the name of the agent that sold me my house in New Jersey.
Right.
I don't. And, I had a decent experience with her. I don't remember what she looks like. I know she sent me, one of those subscriptions or calendars and whatnot.
Right.
But quite honestly, it wasn't that long ago, if you think about it. I think I bought that house in, 07 maybe. So it's only, 5-6 years? I don't remember. I don't. Yeah. And it's something that we've discussed, how real estate agents and brokers have a little bit harder time, doing post-transaction follow-ups and things like that.
Right.
But even more profoundly, though, I guess what I'm saying is once you're in the relationship, then, yeah, I would agree that, real estate agent or real estate broker has a far deeper, far more intense relationship, at least while the transaction is happening.
Yeah.
I think what I'm saying, though, is before you jump into the relationship, at the stage of the consumer is going, hey, I think I might want to buy a house, right? If the first word that pops into their head is Zillow, then they're going to go there. And that changes the relationship between Zillow as a brand, I guess, instead of just as a website, and the rest of the industry. I do think that is possible.
Yeah. I think, it's interesting. A little over a year ago, I went to Christina Wise's Reinvention Conference. And as we know, she has some great fiery speeches to give on this sort of topic. And that's actually something she brought up at her keynote in that event, and relating it to relocation companies. And this is a part of the business that I truly do not understand very well. So if I get it wrong, please forgive me. Mm-hmm. But she described how at one point in time, there were, companies that started processing or handling relocation leads so that people would get them from the relocation kind of company or whatever, and that ended up being this sort of a captive customer base. But the downside was that the commissions, or whatever, how the money was split, got less and less in the realtor's favor. And she learned that kind of behavior was essentially what was going to happen with aggregators like Trulia and Zillow. And I'm probably, horribly, screwing up how she presented it. But that was the basic idea, that basically this has happened before in the industry. It's kind of what she was saying around the idea of relocation. So that except that was perhaps maybe at a B2B level or whatever, where a company dealing with a relocation kind of firm, and maybe Zillow, Trulia being a consumer play at the same kind of strategy. I don't know.
One of the things that, as Rob's describing the process here, that occurs to me is that the white space that we're referring to really relates to the before and after the role of the realtor, the realtor's interaction with the customer. once the realtor is actually working with the customer, the actual sort of opportunities for sort of business expansion, if you like, is exactly where Zillow is playing in terms of before, which we could perhaps characterize as, very primitively as search, and after in terms of very simply again like home maintenance. Like you see Zillow Digs doing that, and you see like some of the financing stuff doing that as well. So
that's a great point, Matthew. Really great.
When we're talking about white space, we're really talking about the areas of the process of home ownership that that are perhaps harder for the individual realtor to manage because it's over a long period of time, and it's exactly the example that you said. Like, I don't remember her name, but I remember that she sent me like a calendar, because it's like that sustained follow-up and relationships sustained over many years that a lot of realtors sort of pride themselves on, that they do have those relationships in place. But as more people perhaps sort of shift online and where those people spend time, that's really the white space sort of opportunity, I think. And Zillow is being very, very aggressive about that and very transparent about that as well. But I think, it's sort of the before and after, because, as we heard here at Direct, consumers on the buying and renting side especially, and to Gaylord's point on the relocation side, they're very happy to do all of that work on the before side online using a Zillow or a Trulia or even like a brokerage website. But to actually sort of get to the closing table and sort of finalize the transaction, that's sort of where the realtor's value comes in. But then once that happens, there's this prolonged period where they're actually in their home prior to the next purchase. That is an enormous space of opportunity for sort of sustaining those relationships. And I think online has like a very, very large part to play in that. And I think, a company like Zillow are making a lot of headway into that in the way that perhaps online brokerage presences are not right now. And that seems to be sort of the rub for me. Does that make sense, Rob?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean,
I guess
think about it a little bit.
I want to clarify what you're saying then, Rob. So you're just saying this Home Depot effect, if Zillow's really trying to take over this brand white space, and as Matthew's saying, there's clearly this in-between period. But if their intention is to take over that space, you're saying the Home Depot effect is essentially that Zillow becomes the place where a consumer initiates contact with an agent, possibly. So that's the hope.
Yes.
And so what does that? And then what does that mean ultimately for? Well, and I think it does to some extent. I don't think they go there thinking I'm going to contact a realtor. I think they're still going there for properties. But I could see that changing maybe. And then what does a broker then do, or even an agent? If that is really the long-term play here, how does an agent get in front of that, or a broker get in front of that?
Well, I don't know if I've got the answer to that, Lynn, but I think there's a couple ways to consider. Like, if it's true that Zillow is trying to basically be the on-ramp for all conversations about real estate, which I think that's probably a safe bet, right? They make some money on advertising. But as they shift more to agent services, I wonder whether it really is like that straight play to, are they going to turn into, I mean, they do, you can get leads or whatever from Zillow now, but how does an agent or broker get in front of that? I think that's like what Christina was warning about in her talk, that time last year, was that there is no getting in front of that. Like, once it's in place and once it's there, and once all, or the majority of consumers begin that conversation at that point, at that website, then at that point the person running that website gets to decide how much it's worth, because that's where all the traffic starts to come from. There's a part of me that I don't see it happening to the degree that Rob is describing in the Home Depot effect. I think that's kind of an extreme. Like, if you were to take what's going on these aggregator sites all the way out to their total extreme, then I would be like, okay, well, let's just go there and we get whatever agent shows up to do the thing, and I don't care. But maybe it does turn out that way. Maybe it's like, okay, these people all have about the same qualifications, same skills, no big deal. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it does go all the way to that. I kind of doubt it, though. I kind of doubt it. But what it really plays into is some of the stuff that Matthew was talking about, I think, in terms of, like, the moments outside of the I am in the market to buy a house right now phase. So if we think about at what moment is it advantageous for anybody to be talking to someone who's doing something with their house? So Zillow's kind of capturing of the entire, consumer life cycle around home ownership, from renting to buying to fixing up and DIY stuff after purchase, gives them, a great advantage in terms of being present at all moments of a person owning a house. Whereas a real estate agent really only has a reason to be involved during those specific moments in which a person is buying a house. And when a real estate agent tries to get involved outside of those moments, you can have a 50-50 chance of it just being kind of creepy and weird, or maybe it was a great relationship and, you are friends afterwards. So it's capturing these specific moments, I think, that are that's maybe an interesting play on it. I don't know. Matthew, what's your take?
Well, as you're describing the process here, I'm sort of reminded of Jim Lisinski's zero moment of truth approach, where it's essentially sort of a white paper that came out of Google, and of course I don't think we can ignore the role of Google even prior to something like Zillow and Trulia as part of this. But the zero moment of truth basically describes the process by which people are making decisions before they actually sort of go to the store and actually do something. So the zero moment of truth is sort of in the real estate context. It's sort of almost like a 2-year process whereby people are doing research and spending time online and watching videos and talking to their friends and all this kind of stuff prior to actually taking action. And one of the things that they sort of relate this process to is the role of advertising in this, that how many times you need to see an ad, either online or on television, sort of the cumulative process of advertising and how that impacts the zero moment of truth, which has direct relationship to what we're talking about with Zillow and the brokerage brands, is that this prolonged exposure to a brand's message starts to really impact that decision-making, pro or con, over time. So I don't think it's, we've all seen the sort of, brand recognition, brand equity numbers for recognizability of brands within the real estate space. And Zillow is not necessarily sort of one of the stronger ones. It does tend to be more a Remax or a Coldwell Banker or a Keller Williams for that kind of conversation. But as Zillow start to sort of make headway in that by having increased ad spend and things like that, they start to sort of chip away at the zero moment of truth sort of process because they're more active in the before and after spaces around the transaction in a way that the brokerages are not necessarily as strong. So one of the great examples that they use in the zero moment of truth sort of case studies is somebody looking at like the wall of, I think, like breakfast cereal in the grocery store, and of course there's like 500 different types in that particular aisle. How do you pick out sort of the one for you? And they sort of back out of that whole sort of decision making process in terms of what you've been exposed to, what you've heard about, what's going to be recognizable to you, and then they sort of apply that to things like mobile and video advertising strategies. It's actually a really, really fascinating set of things to read about how to play in that before space. And I think it's sort of a really interesting sort of parallel to what we're talking about here, because Zillow is fairly new to that game, certainly in comparison to like a Remax or a Coldwell Banker. But I think they're sort of approaching it in more of a new media way than perhaps an old media way. And it's really interesting to see them start to use sort of like older, more traditional ad methodology, like a TV ad or print advertising or, things like that. And, they're starting to sort of, the sense that I get is that they're actually sort of starting to grow up as a brand and not necessarily sort of only be running things online. And I think that's sort of the interesting thing for me, is to see the evolution of how they're actually presenting themselves to the customer, or the brokerage's customer, if you like. And I think that's sort of the interesting thing that could perhaps lead to this erosion that sort of I proposed before, is that you start to erode on that. It starts to impact things like ad dollars. It starts to impact like where brokerages spend their money. Because what we're really talking about is, to Gaylord's point about what Christina was talking about, we're talking about stronger presences within Zillow or Trulia or wherever. I think having a strong presence within that reminds me of Rob's Home Depot example as well. Like, to be that preferred vendor for kitchen cabinets at Home Depot, or that's sort of how you get that business locally. You become sort of referred, or the person that gets the phone call for this stuff. So I think there's a lot of parallels between all our different stories, and I'm trying to sort of tie them all together here. But I think sort of stronger brokerage ad dollar centric presence within the platforms is certainly one way to sort of counteract that kind of stuff. Because to Lindsay's point, I'm not sure that this is really something worth fighting. I think there's room for everybody here, but it's sort of how you play within it, I think.
Well, and I think that's, I happen to agree with you. The thing that maybe, as I started thinking about why is a brand white space to begin with, and then while we're doing this, I went back and looked at a couple of notes. I'm not sure that this can be fought. Right? In other words, like, I agree with what you're saying, Matthew, in terms of a strategy from a brokerage standpoint. So Lindsay, you asked the question of, okay, so if you're a broker agent and you think this is coming, Home Depot effect and so on, what do you do? Matthew, unless I'm missing, what you're saying is, okay, well, you can't fight it, or it's not worth fighting, so why not just become the preferred vendor, within the kind of the quote Home Depot type effect, right? That's essentially what you're saying.
Yeah, it seems to me a more efficient use of your time and dollars,
right,
to work within it rather than to spend your energies fighting it.
Right. Now, having said that, Gaylord talked about the event with Christina Wise, and Christina certainly is like one of the smartest people in the industry. She kind of sees things coming long before, and I think she's probably right in the sense that if we get to this point where Zillow's essentially has the same brand power as Home Depot does in home improvement, then they become the gateway, and they become the conduit. And what will happen then probably is going to be somewhat closer to what Christina imagined in terms of relocation, like what happened with relocation. The strong undercurrent there, and it's not just Christina, there are a lot of brokerages, there are a lot of people in the industry who still think we can fight this. My question is, or really, I think my skepticism is, I don't know if that can be fought in the following sense. The typical transition goes something like, well, if we didn't send them our data, if we didn't send them the listings for free, then they would have no content, so therefore we could fight this. I kind of feel like when they've made the transition into the advertising space, and I'll read a couple of things that Spencer talks about in his Q1 earnings transcript. He said something like 26% of Americans simply can't name a brand at all when it comes to real estate. Something like 88% of Americans don't really have a strong sort of real estate brand that they can recall instantly. So they're saying this is wide open, totally wide open. Zillow, as far as I can tell, they're going to spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $80 million in TV advertising this year. It's not clear because they don't really break it out, sort of wrapped into marketing advertising. But, and they said that they're willing to change that on and on. But Q1, they kind of said, based on our results, we're going to double our spend. Who knows, with Q2 results, they might double their spend again, right? And like I said, just looking at sort of the publicly reported numbers, I think they're going to spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 to $80 million just on TV advertising. Now, I think my question there is, if you are a brokerage, can you compete with that? Can you spend $40 to $80 million? And really, I can only think of, I don't know, maybe 2 to 3 companies that actually even have that kind of money. Realogy is one of them. Home Service America is another. It's possible that, the number 3, number 4 guys could. Well, go ahead.
Rob, let me jump in on it. One thing I think it's important to keep in mind, while on the one hand you're right, they can afford to spend a ton of money. Understanding the difference between national advertising and advertising only in your local market, I think levels that a little bit. I mean, I still think Advantage is still obviously spending $80 million, whatever. But there's still a brokerage that only operates in one region doesn't need to buy an ad nationally, so their expenditure, is comparatively lower. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. I guess what I'm wondering though is, when you do that, what is the impact on brands? So I mean, there are examples from outside of real estate. We have local brands that compete with national brands, right? And they do try to do TV advertising, but it almost seems like a lot of those guys, again, outside of real estate, whether it's restaurant chains or beverages or whatever, I don't know. It's almost like I'm trying to think what makes sense. Like there's McDonald's, obviously we know it's totally national, and they spend billions of dollars in advertising, and they just completely blanket, the advertising space and mind space. So there's not a single American that's never heard the term McDonald's, right? We know that. There could be a local.
I don't know that we can attribute that just to their television ads. We could probably attribute it to the fact that there is one on every corner. Matthew's got more experience than both of us in TV. I bet he's got some thoughts on that.
I mean, it's not just the spend, right? Focusing on the spend is only really sort of part of this.
Of course.
You have to sort of focus on the results of the spend, and that's sort of where it gets really, really gray with a lot of this stuff. Like, how much business did a Super Bowl ad genuinely drive? And it's always really, really difficult to quantify,
yes.
especially in an era where you have sort of like viral stuff, has a more incremental sales lift than TV spends in some instances, for example, right? So it's always really difficult to say, sort of focusing on the ad spend arms race isn't really sort of a fruitful strategy or a conversation. Like, you can just outspend somebody, and you could just go down the rabbit hole of that kind of stuff.
Right.
And I, it's not that Realogy would outspend Zillow or anything like that. You have to sort of focus on the effectiveness of it. And of course, where I think to sort of bring it back to Gaylord's false equivalency thing, it's two different customers. Zillow is obviously trying to target people in a different part of the real estate process than perhaps a brokerage, right?
Of course.
And certainly some of the, I guess you would call it sort of more NAR-centric, American dream, value of an agent kind of stuff, right? It's two different audiences, and you could characterize that saying Zillow is actually targeting agents because that's obviously where a lot of their business and ad dollars.
Actually, let me actually add something to that, Matthew, because I think this is relevant. And I think last week we kind of brought this up, that Zillow is a different business model.
Right.
What Spencer makes clear in the earnings call is that they estimate the agent advertising market, meaning the amount of money that real estate agents and brokers spend on advertising, whether it's themselves or the properties for sale. They think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 to $10 billion a year, right? Which is a lot. Right? Zillow's got a fraction of that. I think their thought is, if we get the consumers, right, if we can totally dominate the consumer mind space, then they're going to be able to really capture huge chunks of that $6 to $10 billion market, right? And I actually think that's doable. Now, so they're not concerned about, getting the consumer to try and promote the value of an agent or anything like that. They're just interested in getting to the consumer so they become, the gateway, just like Home Depot or just like Lowe's or any of the other companies, or H&R Block or what have you. And I don't know that they want to get 100%. I mean, that could always be a goal for a business, but let's say they got 20%, of a $6 billion market. Let's use a lower number. Right? And that's $1.2 billion a year in revenue. Dude, at that point, Zillow shareholders are going to be super freaking happy. And I get why they're doing it, right? And I agree, again, as well, that it's the brokerages and agents and Zillow, they all have sort of different goals, different targets, different advertising, different
business models and all of that. But I think where I'm kind of landing on this right now is, right now, spend is not everything, but it sure is something, right? And FYI, I actually did spend some time in cable TV, so I do sort of know, like, what the effect of that is. And there is a difference between, like, local cable, especially cable local advertising, you know, that gets inserted versus, like, some of these national buys that happen. Zillow's doing national buys in different markets. And the biggest proof statement for me that this is doing something for these guys is not that simply they're coming out and saying stuff. They're not just coming out and saying, oh, yeah, you know, things are going well. They're saying things are going so well that we're actually going to put more money down. I'm like, that's pretty freaking significant. Right? Same thing with Century 21 or, you know, Remax or any of the other guys. You know, Century 21 did the big Super Bowl ad. None of us know. I don't know what the impact of that was for them. But we didn't hear Century 21 come out and say, you know what, that was so successful. We're not only going to advertise Super Bowl, we're going to do a Super Bowl ad, we're going to do a World Series ad, we're going to do NBA Finals ad, we're going to spend another $40 million in advertising. Because after we did the Super Bowl ad, we made, you know, a couple $100 million in additional revenues. We haven't heard that. We haven't seen that sort of action yet. So it may be that, you know, for a brokerage, it doesn't make sense, a whole lot of sense to do direct consumer advertising, especially on expensive mediums like TV. It may be that, like you say, Matthew, that the broker is better off just saying, you know what, let Zillow deal with all the consumer advertising, all that expensive spend. We just want to brand ourselves within Zillow, and it's much more cost efficient. Our revenues will go up. You know, our agents will do more business. We'll do more transactions. You know, and that might be a happy medium. You know, I mean, can you see that sort of future?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're already starting to see it. You know, from a personal perspective, we see social fueling a lot of that stuff where, you know, the protracted sort of presence over sort of 2 or 3 years within social, like where people are actually spending time either on their phones or, you know, sort of elsewhere online, the more aggressive that particular process is for an individual brokerage, and I say this from the Corcoran side, I guess, the more aggressive the volume of Corcoran visibility, if you like, within Zillow or Trulia becomes. There's a correlation between those two things, and obviously, like Google search has a part to play in that. But the more earned media that you're able to work with online, the more natural the organic shift within syndication, which actually comes a lot further down into the process, right? You say, you know, what is it, 2 years, according to the NAR consumer study, that people consider themselves to be in the market. The syndication is like not that much of that particular window. It's only really more towards the end when they're actually sort of starting to lock in on actual property search, and not this sort of like neighborhood search or what can I afford or any of this other stuff that happens sort of in the other parts of the window. When they actually start to sort of really refine their search and look at specific properties and with a goal to reaching out to an agent, you know, that's where you start to see sort of the results of the sort of previous 2 years worth of work that happens elsewhere online. So, you know, at that point, you know, just to throw a wrench in here, it actually becomes less and less about spend. It actually becomes more about like referrals and word of mouth and earned media rather than paid media. And that becomes really, really difficult to measure because, you know, you can't necessarily put dollars on the front end of that particular equation. It's more dollars on the back end because it's tied to things like investment of time and content and, you know, things like that. So it's a really, really sort of thorny conversation when it comes to media spend versus results, because that's certainly like a very linear way of measuring these things. But I think that the actual process of actually sort of reaching out to an agent and purchasing a house is a lot less linear than we're perhaps characterizing it here.
I think I think there's a couple, like since you said measuring, I've got to throw in on that a little bit. There's a couple things that I've been thinking about while you guys have been talking about this, and one of them is I wonder, I think it's clear that the Zillow approach is taking, they're pursuing kind of all aspects, all stages of home ownership, right? So they're trying to be relevant at nearly every stage of a person's relationship with real estate, of a consumer's relationship. And real estate agents and brokers are typically only relevant in one kind of moment of that. And even within that 2-year moment, like you're saying, Matthew, they're actually only relevant during the latter half of that or less. Right. They're not relevant up in the front part of it, and Zillow is relevant throughout all of it. Part of me just wonders if that's just the kind of tactical mindset of a sales-driven culture that focuses just on, well, what did I sell today? What did I sell today? What am I going to sell tomorrow? And not always perhaps taking a long view. And that's something I think we see in not just in real estate, but in other sales-focused industry. Car dealers, I think, is another good example of that, where people, as opposed to being focused on the entire life cycle, are just looking at one specific area of it, and that leaves it open for someone else to come in and scoop up and become the channel for delivering people like that. But there are ways to measure some of that. If a brokerage or an agent wanted to pursue a longer, advertising or earned media kind of method, where you can do the kind of work that I see you guys doing at Corcoran and at some other brokerages as well, and you can measure the results of that kind of early stage content or engagement or advertising, any one of those 3 kind of methods, and see if it correlates to sales later. And I think the challenge there is that that takes a certain amount of willpower and investment at a leadership level that is difficult for people to focus on, I think.
It takes a long time.
So it takes a long, right? Because you're talking about what, a 7-year cycle or 6-year cycle or something, or even if you brought it down to the 2 years of in market and said, well, we've been advertising, we had this much response, or we have this much acquisition via our advertising to people who are wondering if they can afford a house or wondering about a neighborhood. And I think you can map some of that out to a certain degree in a linear fashion.
Yeah.
It's just that I think that most agents and brokers are focused only on that last part. Like, did they call me to see a specific house? And some people a little bit more broad than that, some people a little less broad than that, who knows? But
yeah, sure.
But a person could put in the effort to measure that and see what kind of impact it has. The problem is you're gathering that data one season at a time. And so that's like a long view. It requires a long view that isn't always, the long view instinct isn't always there for, heavily, sales-focused as opposed to marketing-focused organizations. And that's not just like a ding on real estate or whatever for being too tactical. It's normal. I think it's not a criticism. It's just what it is. And there are other industries that deal with this.
So let me ask you guys something. I mean, I think when you think about this whole conversation about brand white space and what it means and how brokers and agents should respond, I feel like it actually ties in pretty well with something I read recently. Like, have you guys read the article on Inman by Renwick Congdon, who's the CEO of Impress? Have you guys seen this?
No, tell us about it. Tell us what was in the article.
So, I didn't make the initial connection, but the article, I think, is titled "Fix for Broken Brokerage Model." Say that fast. Broken brokerage model, right, is within the description. So what Renwick, I guess he presented this at the CEO Summit in January. What he's suggesting is that brokerages, the way they are set up today, with sort of the whole heavy emphasis on recruiting and retention and kind of, getting agents into the fold is not going to work. And what he's proposing is essentially that brokers think of themselves as, more of a B2B, entity, that their job is to foster and invest in companies in a sort of brokerage within a brokerage. And, he comes up with this whole idea that, each agent, could be an agent owner, sets up an LLC, and then the broker could take a percentage of that LLC. It's actually worth checking out, the article. But I'm taking this, and there's been some positive responses to it. There are a couple of things that's interesting about this. Number one, a lot of the KW agents who then came on this post and started commenting are saying things like, well, this is exactly what we do at KW, right? The agent team concept, which is really strong at KW, they're essentially saying it's exactly like what Renwick is describing. The brokerage is nothing more than an assemblage of, these agent teams, which are more or less little companies in and of themselves, right? If that's true, if that is actually a valid business model for brokerage, and I'm saying now let's throw in this whole conversation we've been having about brand white space and consumer, awareness and the gateway and the Home Depot effect and so on and so forth. Does that work? And what do you guys think about this notion that, Renwick's notion that the future of brokerage, like his whole proposition essentially is brokerage model is busted. Let's fix it by making the broker become essentially like an investor, like a portfolio manager, a number of LLCs, and each LLC would be an agent or an agent team or what have you. Well, if you outsource all of the sort of consumer lead generation to a company like Zillow, and taking after Matthew, and you say, look, the best use of investment from that standpoint is just to be well branded or be one of the top service providers within Zillow, right? Could that work? I guess is the question.
Yeah.
Matthew, what do you think? I mean, you're right in line with the brokerage operations. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, rhetorically, yes, of course it could work. Whether it will work or whether it's actually going to be sort of feasibly adopted or something, I think that it's difficult to say, isn't it? But I feel like sort of every sort of 5 or 6 months there's the broken brokerage model. Yeah, it is difficult to say.
Yeah.
A broken brokerage model sort of conversation comes up, and it seems to sort of coincide with conference season, I guess. But I think that the reinvention of the industry, of course, I agree that happens. It needs to happen primarily at the agent level, and I think that certainly from our perspective, all our agents are independent contractors anyway, so it's sort of moot that the brokerage would support and sort of invest in its own agents. I think that's a very obvious point to make. But in terms of facilitating a third party to handle lead generation, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that kind of stuff, because I think there are many. I'm not entirely bought into this idea of Zillow being sort of the exclusive gateway for this kind of thing. I think that there are. I agree that it is a gateway and an increasingly important one, but I think that it's not necessarily your Home Depot and Lowe's kind of analogy. That's where I start to sort of move away from what you're talking about, because I think that there are many gateways, if you like, for the real estate process. And I think, just to tie it back to what we heard here at Direct and what we've heard from our more successful agent conversations, it's all about the gateway is tied to the relevance outside of the transaction, I think. And that's sort of the brand white space that you're talking about with Zillow, I think, is that, the most successful agents, we know that they spend 2 to 3 hours on the phone every single day remaining relevant to the people that they used to work with. And that's sort of how to tie these things together, I think, because, for the brokerage to invest in that particular process, I think to some extent that already happens. Could it happen more? Yes. But I don't think that that's necessarily a stretch, and I think I think there are many brokerages that would just sort of agree that the level of investment in their own agents is never high enough. It's sort of like it could always be higher. So it's sort of a moot discussion, I think. It's because I think it already to some extent happens and isn't necessarily sort of addressed by what's been proposed here, right?
Yeah, to some degree, this sounds like it is a conversation we've been having forever, right? The standard model of brokerages is how many butts can I put in a seat and call it a call it a business, and that furthermore that the entire industry kind of is like a fractal of that. You have the brokerages do that, and then the franchises say how many brokerages can I fill up seats with, and the associations do the same thing. So I'm not sure I understand exactly what the new model that's being proposed here really is, unless they're saying like to really go all the way out and say no, actually let's really do this, and from now on, instead of being a brokerage firm, we're going to be a venture capital firm, and we're going to do the kinds of things venture capital does for investing in a business. It's the same model, though, frankly. It's just a different mindset within that same model. And that actually could be kind of interesting because, like a VC fund doesn't like buy your ads and sell you customers. A VC fund, provides other stuff, and maybe they do that, but it's pretty unlikely.
Right. No, and I think Renwick's model, as I think I thought about it, it's actually a lot like an accelerator, right?
Yeah.
One of these like Y Combinators, whatever. They'll say something like, "Hey, we'll give you office space, we'll give you a little bit of funding, we'll offer you this, that, and the other thing, and then you got to go out and make
ownership.
it." Correct, but we're going to take like a 20% share, in your company. Yeah. So I think what Renwick is suggesting is that instead of, brokers running out and hiring agents as independent contractors, the brokers run out and bring agents on as LLCs, in which
the challenge
the brokerage...
there, I guess, is that this would be kind of interesting. So you'd need to have, like, in the VC world, the entrepreneur team usually develops a prototype and pitches it.
Right.
So the agents would need to develop their prototype for how their operation is going to run and then pitch it.
Right. Or maybe it's a little bit more like a franchise where the broker says, "Here's our model, here's our prototype, here's our training, here's our methodology, here's our systems, here's our tools, and we're going to give it to you in exchange for 30%." Well, I think the difference is this notion of creating a corporate entity, right? That the agent would not be an individual independent contractor. The agent would have to form, like in the LLC, of some sort of company, right, through which the agent would go and do the business. Now, Renwick does point out, like, there are some problems with this, namely state licensing laws, which may or may not allow something like that. But at a conceptual level, what's fascinating about it is the notion that brokers would effectively become, to your point, we could either call them venture capitalists or accelerators or some combination of like a franchise acceleration VC type model. The question I have there is whether agents go for it. So you know what? I mean, we have Lindsay. Hey, Lindsay, are you there?
Yeah.
Let me ask you, you're a realtor. Would you be open to something like that? Could you imagine joining a brokerage and the broker saying, "You know what, I'm going to train you, I'm going to give you all this stuff, I'm going to, whatever it is that they're going to offer. In exchange, I want 30% of the equity. Like whether you stay with my firm or not, you're going to be paying me 30% of your profits for perpetuity." I mean, would you be open to something like that?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, for equity, that's rather than a split, there's...
rather than a split, it's an equity.
I don't know. I mean, I guess the thing is you'd have to be really showcasing a ton of value for that to make sense for me. Like, are you going to give me the underlying systems, which is what every agent team needs? Like, how do I manage the workflow and the underlying systems and put that together for me? I mean, it would have to be really substantial for me to say. Because the other thing I think about once we start really talking about significant agent teams is eventually, like, unless there's a significant limit to how many dollars I'm giving the company, why wouldn't I just go out on my own? And there's got to be some significant brand something or...
Well, I mean, you could,
like
but the
Brad
idea
Anderson doesn't like go in and like say, here's my crappy CRM tool and give you a 1-hour class and then call it and then say, now I own 30% of your company.
I guess the agents would sort of pick it, but that's exactly it.
Well, the other thing is,
VC, right?
Yeah, I mean, it would create a certain kind of market, right? Like your VC, like there in the entrepreneur space, there's all kinds of conversations among entrepreneurs around like which funds do they want to be a part of, which VC do they actually want to work with. So it would create a more of a conversation than I perceive currently happening in the real estate world. It's an interesting idea. I mean, the idea of pitching, it's interesting.
I'd love to know what it would be like to be in that environment, though, because when you think about most offices, usually only have like one or two significant teams within the office. They're leading the office production. They have this team. There's not usually like a whole group of people in the same market space in the same office that operate big teams like that. I don't know.
But a lot of
exactly
funded companies fall down and don't make any money either. Like that's the other. Like VCs make their money on the one or two big hits as well.
Right. I mean, it's a portfolio theory, right? I mean, if 1 out of 10 hits, then you make all your money from that. But Matthew, I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think obviously, I'm thinking about the recruitment process, which is basically sort of what you guys seem to be proposing, is that the nature of recruitment would change, where really instead of the brokerages trying to attract people, it would be more the case where people would have to, like you, to use your language, to pitch to be sort of members of that portfolio, if you like. And I think, to Gaylor's point, it is a really, really interesting idea, especially, from the sort of strategic brokerage level, is that, you have to be a lot more sort of ruthlessly editing who exactly you recruit, because especially if it's going to be tied to a model that's not necessarily predicated on splits, to Lindsay's point. So I think it's a really interesting idea. I think there's like you said, there's a lot that would need to change before something like that would even become sort of a reality. The way the licensing laws and stuff like that. But as a recruitment model, I think it's a really, really interesting idea, because the value of the brokerage actually becomes paramount at that particular point, because it ties those two things together. It's like we are just as invested in your success as you are, and that isn't perhaps what's the best way to describe it? Is it can always be stronger. That kind of thing, like the relationship between, the sort of corporate entity of the brokerage and the individual sort of independent contractor agent. So, like Lindsay said, it's all about like what can you do to help me grow my business, and actually tying those two things together in a more concrete way at the recruitment stage, that makes a lot of sense.
It makes perfect sense, and I think this is where I want to then bring back in this whole conversation we had about Zillow, brand white space, and it doesn't just fancy Zillow. I mean, obviously there will be a lot of companies, Trulia, Realtor.com, everyone's going to be trying to go after that. Here's what I think is fascinating about it. I think, given my personal take on it is, I don't know that anyone can fight the big guys, the Zillows, the Trulias, the public companies, on the buyer side, right? Because it's so intricately tied to search. It's so intricately tied to, hey, I want to buy a house. But I do think that on the sales side, on the listing side, I don't know that Zillow, Trulia, any of these guys have any particular advantage. Even if they were to become the dominant brand, I don't know that would happen. So it could be that as brokers, whatever model, right? And I do think there's something interesting about Renwick's model, but it almost feels like one of the presuppositions there is that you concede the buy side. You work with the portals, you work with the companies that are out there really trying to get the consumer, mind share in terms of brand on the buy side. And then maybe one of the things that you do then as a broker is you really focus on the sale and the listing side, whether that's through training and equity positions in these LLC type of, like a venture capital type of push that Renwick is talking about, or more of a traditional, we just want to go and recruit. But it almost feels like at that point on the buy side, because there's such dominant, brands out there, you're almost having to focus on the listing and sales side. I mean, that's kind of my instinct on it right now. What do you guys think?
Well, at the end of the day, Zillow needs agent content, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. At the end of the day, agents supply content that they get from sellers to Zillow, and that everybody's model is totally dependent upon that particular thing. So I don't think that's going to change. Sorry, Gaylor, to jump in.
Oh no, I think that was I think there's that piece, but there's also Rob, you're saying that basically seed the buyer side and focus, on the listing. I think that's a strategy that a lot of people are pursuing already. A lot of brokerage and agent, search listings on their website are really just there so that they have something to talk about in a listing presentation. So in some ways, I think the industry is already at what you're describing. They're not many people have what appears to be a buyer-focused website, but it's really there just because they want it to look good to someone who might list their house with them, to say, oh, well, we've got a page where your thing will show up, and we'll put it on the homepage as a featured listing, all this other stuff that, sometimes matters, but quite often doesn't.
Right. I think that's a pretty interesting transition, and if that's the case, then this whole war that we're going through, with let's fight Zillow, let's fight Trulia, let's fight Realtor.com, it's like, all right, well, that's got a shelf life, because that's just going to get solved.
Absolutely.
And maybe as Matthew said,
6 years, right? We would say that for a long time. We would say that for a long time. Though.
I know.
So, people make money on the existence of this quote unquote war, and as long as people are making money off of the existence of it, people will continue to make a big deal about it. Sure. Matthew said, some of these issues about the bad brokerage models, et cetera, they peak around conference season, and there are reasons for all this stuff.
I think but I guess to me, the arms merchants, as you will, right? They can continue to make money as long as there's a conflict. But if one side just simply wins outright, then the conflict is pretty much over. At that point, it is going to become sort of focusing on, where where brokerages, frankly, or agents or whatever MLS, where those guys can actually provide value and make some money.
Which would be great. That would be great if that's what we're talking about.
The nature of the conflict shifts, Rob. The nature of the conflict becomes more like the kind of SEO type conflict, where it becomes about conflicted presence within those platforms.
Right.
It becomes like, okay, how do I get more share within Zillow over my competition? Like the conflict still probably exists, but the nature of it and the place where it happens changes.
Right, and the conflict at that point, so it shifts from broker versus aggregator to broker versus broker within aggregator. And I think in that fight, I could see, what Gaylord's suggesting, that, the brokerage that does a better job of focusing on the seller, really focusing on the listings, really focusing on, enabling their agents, whether that's an independent contractor or an LLC, to really go after the sales side business, the listing side business, because the buyer side is already taken care of, right? One way or the other. Well, maybe they're the ones who are going to win.
Yeah. To dial that in with what Matthew's saying about basically how do you increase your presence within a specific channel like Zillow, you increase your presence by having the most listings in it.
That's a really good point. Yeah, and
one of your favorite topics of big guys are going to crush little guys. It's that's one of the areas, right? Is having a dominant share of listings, and not like a 2% lead or 1% lead, but like a sizable lead over your competitors in terms of the volume of listings, not the dollar value or anything else, but just the sheer number, because those websites generate an individual page for every listing that you have. So that's you start to get into those kinds of things. But a conflict continues, and it just it dials into a specific channel, like Matthew said.
It's not just. I agree with everything you're saying, Gaylord. It's not just volume, though. Volume is very, very important, but it's also placement.
Yeah.
We're talking about placement within search, right? So appearing on that first set of results, which obviously speaks to relevancy as well. So, from the sort of ad dollar world, placement and relevance is obviously something you can buy, and that's outside of the volume conversation. But it also becomes about content and things like time spent with listings. Because at that point you're talking about not only volume, but you're talking about conversion, which is sort of the kind of end game of all this. It's
right.
You can be a big person in there, but you need to be an effective person in there, and that's how to win the conflict, I think.
We can't just put bad MLS photos and descriptions of property all in caps with abbreviations and misspellings and like that.
No chalk outlines of the previous.
The previous owner, right? I think Lindsay's trying to wrap us up. I'll get out of the way while I do that.
Yeah, we're kind of wrapping up and closing in on about an hour here, so I thought I'd jump in here and wrap up. But I think this is such an interesting call because clearly anyone who's, and even an active agent, active broker, obviously these are things that strategically they have to think about long term, especially with Zillow investing the way they are. I think everybody's got to be thinking about it and talking about it. So great talking to all you guys again, and looking forward to the next time.
Great, thanks.
All right. Good stuff, everybody. Talk to you next week.
Bye.
It's the magic number. Somewhere in this hip-hop soul community.